It's Tuesday, June the 16th, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining the social, economic, political and geopolitical concerns of a world that's ever-changing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Neil Ferguson, the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I'm sitting in for our usual host, Bill Whalen, who's off this week. Now, those of you who've been watching us regularly know the format. For you first-time viewers, this is a conversation in which three Hoover Senior Fellows, we call ourselves the GoodFellows, it's irony, by the way, offer our unique insights into what may lie ahead in these complicated times. This week, we're joined by a guest GoodFellow, this time Francis Fukuyama, the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, also the director of the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy, and the Mosbacher Director of FSI's Center on Democracy. Now, Frank has written widely on issues relating to questions of democratization and international political economy, but he's probably best known for his essay, The End of History, published in the summer of 1989, which came to seem almost prophetic when the Berlin Wall came down just months later. His most recent book is Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. Welcome, Frank.
Thanks for having me.
Now let's meet the regular GoodFellows. John Cochran is an economist and the Hoover Institution's Rosemarie and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. He's also the author of the Grumpy Economist blog, which you really should bookmark as a must-read. Hello, John.
Hi.
And last but not least is Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, the Hoover Institution's Food and Michel Adjami Senior Fellow. Prior to returning to Hoover, he served as the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. General McMaster is also the author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. It's coming out this fall, but you can pre-order it now. Hello, HR.
Hi, Neil, and welcome, Frank.
Thanks very much.
Now, Frank, you have a new piece in the current issue of Foreign Affairs entitled The Pandemic and Political Order. I'm going to start with your essay and with you and a quotation. The pandemic, you wrote, has shone a bright light on existing institutions everywhere, revealing their inadequacies and weaknesses. Now, I've heard from a number of different sources the argument that the pandemic's revealed the weakness of democracies and the strength of authoritarian regimes. In other words, the United States has had a bad pandemic and China has had a good one. But that's not the argument you're making in this essay, is it?
No, so I think that just comparing two countries, even if they're emblematic of authoritarian and democratic government like China and the US, is not statistically, a valid way of establishing comparisons between large and varied groups of countries. And so I think if you look beyond those two, you'll see that there are many authoritarian countries that have done pretty badly, Turkmenistan or Belarus or Russia itself. And there are also democracies that have done well. South Korea, Taiwan, Germany all have, in fact, South Korea and Taiwan have better records in dealing with COVID than China does, and they're both liberal democracies. And so I don't think it's the regime type that really determines how good your public health response to this crisis has been.
You say the factors responsible for successful pandemic responses have been state capacity, social trust, and leadership. Countries with all three have performed impressively. Is there any way of kind of figuring out why some countries have these things? Is this just a kind of matter of historical luck? How do you explain the trifecta that makes for a competent and effective response to a pandemic?
Well, the state capacity part is a matter of historical accumulation. It really takes a lot of effort to build a competent state. That means having adequate human capital. It means having a public health system with trained doctors and nurses and people running public agencies. So that is really something that actually correlates to some extent with how wealthy you are, because richer countries can build these things. But I do think that one of the reasons that East Asia has come up as rapidly as it has over the past 3 generations is that they always had a modern state. That tradition in China goes back many more centuries before that such a state appeared in Europe. And so in a way, it's not surprising that East Asian countries in general have done well. The trust part, well, the leadership part is complicated. I think that where the leadership has faltered is particularly in countries that have had populist leaders. And I would say the United States and Brazil are prime examples of that. I think in general, populist leaders want to be popular. They don't want to associate themselves with unpleasant things. And that's led them to kind of override delegation of to experts or deference to experts in terms of designing their response. The trust factor is also, I think, pretty critical because in a public health emergency, you don't want to have to compel people to do the things that are good for, the general public. And if you don't trust the judgment of your leaders, if you don't trust the government, if, as in this country, you're extremely polarized into red and blue, then you're not going to have the level of trust that's going to allow for that kind of voluntary compliance. So I think all of these things are, conditions that have determined outcomes in this crisis.
Can I go after you on the leadership issue? You wrote pretty critically about President Trump in this essay. Quote, "It was the country's singular misfortune to have the most incompetent and divisive leader in its modern history at the helm when the crisis hit." But I wonder if I could push back a bit, because it seems to me that although the media have done their best to make it all about President Trump, in truth, what went wrong in the United States was a good deal further down the ladder of the federal government, to be precise, at the Department of Health and Human Services, where they had an assistant secretary for preparedness whose job this was, who seems to have been missing in action for most of the last 5 months. It went wrong at CDC, where they had notionally prepared for a pandemic, but when one actually came along, they entirely failed to ramp up testing. I wondered, as I was reading your essay, if you were making the mistake of attaching too much importance to the man at the top. I know the buck stops there, but ultimately, isn't a pandemic really a test of the public health bureaucracy? And that failed in the United States, so far as I can see.
Well, look, these failures have multiple sources, and obviously the CDC made a big mistake in February when they tried to develop a test and they didn't open themselves up to different alternatives and so forth. So that was clearly a mistake. But, if you think about why these bureaucracies are not performing, this is an administration that came in with complete contempt for the US government, right? The whole thing was getting rid of the deep state, which basically meant the permanent bureaucracy and all of the experts that exist in the US government to handle a crisis like this. And they replaced them with political appointees that didn't have the expertise, or left those positions simply unfilled. It is ultimately the responsibility of the president to make sure that those bureaucracies are working properly. And this president didn't do that. There was an office in the White House that was supposed to deal with pandemic response that was shut down. He could have revived that office at any point. He could have taken warnings much earlier than he did to actually ramp up the ability of these bureaucracies to deal with things. So I think that it's really hard to avoid, the personal responsibility of the president, who up until about the second week in March was insisting that this wasn't even a crisis, and therefore did nothing to urge, the ramping up of testing, of, getting the CDC to fix the problems that had been, made evident in February.
HR, can I throw this one at you? After all, you served in the administration, and as somebody who's been involved in military campaigns and crises of national security, you must have a view of this. Sure, the buck stops with the president, but in a crisis like this, isn't it to some extent the responsibility of people further down the administrative ladder to respond and give the president good advice? It's not clear to me that happened.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is a failure at a number of levels to be able to mobilize the kind of medical response that was necessary. And of course, we're not a centralized system from a healthcare perspective, from a governance perspective. And I think what this crisis has laid bare is the need for better coordination and integration across departments and agencies. What Frank is alluding to is kind of the role of the National Security Council in doing that, and an emphasis on coordination across levels of government. And what we're seeing here in particular, because we don't have a national healthcare system, is the need for even better coordination between the public and private sectors. And I think these are the lessons that we have to learn together. What really concerns me is that we may not learn anything because we are so caught up in the vitriolic partisan politics these days, and we're reeling from this, this triple crisis, right? Of COVID, of the economic effect, and now the outrage about inequality and police brutality in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. So I think that there's a failure at a number of levels. I think that reflexively, because President Trump is a polarizing figure, right? You either love him or you hate him. And I think that what's unfortunate about so much of the debate is it has fallen out along those lines, when it is obviously a much bigger issue that requires really a nonpartisan effort, to get to much better implementation. As I mentioned previously, Frank, we had three pillars, in the strategy for on a previous episode here of response, right? The first was, okay, detect it early and contain it, right? Okay, that was sort of foiled by the Chinese Communist Party. The second is to innovate rapidly with therapies, but then really especially a vaccine. I think that's going okay. And the investments made over several administrations to build out really the capability and the capacity for rapid manufacturing at scale of vaccines, I think that's going to pay off. The third is where we've stumbled into this problem, right? Which and seen the difficulties is in mobilizing the response, right, across the government and with the private sector. And Frank, I just like to ask you what you see as the main obstacles to getting better, right? I mean, you're an expert really at not only just what it takes to make institutions function, but what it's going to take for us to work together on these solutions, right? And I have I'm going to quote from, but I have my dog ear and marked copy of Identity here to bring up as well. But Frank, I just want to ask you what you see in terms of what is uniquely American about the difficulties that we've encountered, and what can we do to compensate for our deficiencies, but at the same time, kind of maximize the potential associated with a more decentralized system?
Well, so HR, you're asking actually two very different questions. I think, one has to do with the basic polarization in this country, which I think is built around these identity issues. And that's a whole nother discussion. I mean, that's a really complicated one that is very deeply rooted in many things that have been going on really for the last, 20, 30 years. I think that in terms of a government response, I've felt for many years that we basically need a new Pendleton Act. We need a public sector reform. This is something that has been the least favorite topic you can bring up in Washington on the part of both Republicans and Democrats, because everybody loves to hate the bureaucracy. Nobody really wants to work to improve its performance. I think there's lots of things that could happen. This is a problem that preceded Trump by many decades. Paul Volcker led two national commissions on reform of public service, and none of his recommendations were ever taken up. But I think the more important thing is something that actually, now I know this is a Hoover production, and I'm sorry if this sounds offensive to certain ears, but it really goes back to to the Reagan administration, that there was this deep contempt for government itself, or this very great skepticism about government that I think prevented us from making the kinds of investments in state capacity, which the Europeans and people in Asia really don't have any hesitation about. It's one of those aspects that Marty Lipset kept referring to about American exceptionalism, right? That exceptionalism means we're exceptionally good, but we're also exceptionally bad in certain respects. And one of the deepest characteristics of American political culture is this dislike of the state. And I think that that has prevented us from grappling seriously with the kinds of gaps in state capacity, these gaps in expertise that I think really hurt us in a moment of crisis. So if I were to take advantage of the current moment and you had the political opportunity for doing this kind of reform, that's the place I would begin with.
Maybe I could do a little history here. I don't think when Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States, he lamented the lack of state capacity. In fact, he looked around and marveled at the fact that Americans could do so much with relatively little state capacity, and particularly central government. An alternative reading of history looks not so much at the 1980s as at the 1970s. This is an argument that Chris DeMuth and others have made, that the birth of the administrative state really comes then, if not earlier, and that it's this growth of a very large federal government with dozens, more than 60 different federal agencies that leads to the pathologies that we've seen in 2020. I was really struck when I looked at the 1957-58 pandemic at how well the federal government handled it, when of course it was a much smaller federal government and it didn't have this sort of accumulated bureaucracy, which seems to have made such a mess of CDC as an institution. But I'm sure John is itching to jump in and say perhaps a few words in defense of small government too.
Yeah, well, before we get down to the economic issues, I like the way we started with sort of it's Trump's fault, and I think we've gone to, well, these are issues that go back decades. That America, despite its wealth, has not built a state capacity. And in fact, what Neil just said, in some sense, we had a state capacity and it has deteriorated. I'll say, that the Reagan era, which didn't actually reduce much in the way of regulation anyway, but it was built on the abject failures of the regulatory state that had come to there. Now, America, we're not good at building state capacity at the federal level, but the state capacity we built was horrendously incompetent and counterproductive. And I think that was a reason for much of its, for the reaction against it. And that's the problem we face right now. I mean, I'm not convinced that had Hillary Clinton won the election and put different people in charge of the CDC, that we would have not seen all the same that we would have had an Iceland experience and not seen the whole low-level failures. And our bureaucracy fails in many other respects. Look what it costs to build a subway under New York compared to what it costs to build this, and how, the decades it takes to get all the permits and planning. Just as one of the many examples, look at what our state capacity did to the inner cities in the 1970s and threatens to do it again. So I think this is where I want to push Francis a little bit. There's a sense that we had a state capacity at the end of World War II in the 1950s, and it has eroded. There's sort of a sense of end of empire, like the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the Ancien Regime, where a government's bureaucratic state capacity systems existed, but become hidebound by regulation, tradition, politics, call it what you want. And then then that state is unable to meet the challenge of a political movement or a small pandemic by historical standards of what pandemic means. So rebuilding that state capacity, I think, is the number one thing. But I don't think it's as easy as just put the right people in charge or pass an act. So what do you think, Francis? Is this end of empire? Or are we the Ottoman Empire waiting for the First World War to topple us?
Look, I'd be the first to admit that a lot of the problems in the American state, originate in the left. So public sector unions in many places create too many rigidities. I could go on for hours about trying to build infrastructure in California. I mean, there's a reason we don't build infrastructure. It's a perfect conspiracy between Republicans who don't want to pay for it and Democrats who want to permit it to death, right? So there's blame to be shared on both sides. That being said, I do think, however, that there's some things that people don't quite understand. So we actually have approximately the same number of full-time federal employees in the US government as we did in the early 1960s. The volume of spending that those bureaucrats oversee has quintupled in that period. The Health and Human Services centers for Medicare and Medicaid have, something like 2,200 employees to oversee the spending of $300 million, $1 billion of federal spending, policing all of the Medicare fraud and so forth. So in a sense, the capacity has deteriorated simply because the job of the federal government, as you said, has gotten a lot larger, but we're just not willing to hire anybody, and so we hire contractors instead. But, I think the thing that really worries me is actually the new capacity that's coming in. Very, very few of my students want to go into the federal government. Now most of my students are very public spirited, and if they are, they'll go into an international organization like the UN or the World Bank. They'll go to an NGO, or they'll go to the private sector, thinking the private sector may be able to do public functions. But the last place they want to work for is the federal government. And that's, again, because we've made it really difficult. The compliance requirements for just getting a job in the federal government are very high. The rigidities that are imposed on federal workers, you can't be taken to lunch by anybody, including, your sister, if you're a federal employee, because you've got all of these rules that, surround you. So there's a lot of things that really make our state capacity weak right now. And that's why I'm saying we really do need a thoroughgoing civil service reform that will deal with these problems that have been created. I agree, both on the left and the right. But you do have to, I think, beyond that, create a certain pride in that. And that's the stuff that I don't hear ever coming out of the right, except for the military, right? That actually it's a good thing to be a federal bureaucrat, that it's an honorable profession, that if, like my father-in-law worked for the U.S. Soil Service in Lincoln, Nebraska, his whole career, helping farmers to, adjust to different soil conditions. He had a PhD in soil science. There are lots and lots of people in the U.S. government that are squirreled away doing this kind of thing. Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, is actually very good because he interviews a lot of these people. And I think that, in a sense, what we need is a kind of cultural revolution where people all of a sudden say, yeah, actually, public service is a good career. It's something I want to do because I care about the common good. And again, the military is really, I think, the only place where that kind of spirit still exists. And I think that's something that really needs to be broadened to other parts of the U.S. government.
Perhaps we can also add the capacity for low-level bureaucrats to innovate, which right now everybody is just cover your butt. As examples, the TSA, I just saw like a week ago, the TSA thought, maybe we should put thermometers on, people getting in line to get on airplanes. The Chinese had that system in January. It's just a buy it, put it in, measure people's temperature. They still don't have it. We saw it's just very slow to innovate and do things. We're just following the rule book.
Well, but the risk aversion in the bureaucracy is something real, but it's also the byproduct, I think, of the polarization. Because if you're a bureaucrat and you take a risk, like Solyndra, for example, right? So the Obama administration wanted to put money behind alternative fuels. They were trying to act like a venture capitalist. Maybe it wasn't a good program overall, but if you're going to be a venture capitalist, you're going to have some failures. And that was a failure. But then that becomes, the issue of government corruption and waste. And so I think if you say appropriately that you do want federal bureaucrats to be able to innovate and take risks, you can't punish them for that. Or there has to be something, like in the military called the freedom to fail, where if you do take a risk and it doesn't work out well, but it was a well-calculated risk, it doesn't end your career. It may even enhance your career.
Frank, there's a question I want to ask about the economy now, because it seems to me that part of what you've been arguing now for some years is that really the United States needs to get a bit more European. It needs to have a kind of proper Hegelian state. And that would be somehow more convincing if Europe consistently outperformed the US economically. Now, one of the things you say in your foreign affairs essay is that you expect it to be a long, slow haul back to economic health after the pandemic. But actually, we're getting some pretty surprising numbers from the US economy. The unemployment rate turned out to be lower than expected. And we've just had some numbers and consumption that surprised, as they say in Wall Street, to the upside. Wouldn't it slightly spoil the argument if the US economy recovered much more rapidly than the European economies, as of course happened after the financial crisis? Isn't there a kind of trade-off here that we need to be explicit about, that the corollary of the relatively ramshackle federal government is a more dynamic private sector?
Well, there's no question that the American private sector is very dynamic, very entrepreneurial. They take risks in a way that a lot of Europeans don't. So I don't think that I would contest that. But I do think that, one of the things that holds the Europeans back is actually the social safety net they've created, which it prevents, good performance on the upside, but it also is a safety net. I mean, it also keeps a lot of people from falling off the cliff when things go bad, and that's a trade-off it's a value trade-off that I think is actually perfectly legitimate in their case. I think that the fact that we still to this day do not have a universal government-mandated healthcare system is a complete scandal, because it's one of the most obvious things that a state can actually do that virtually every other rich country has a system like this in place, except for the United States. And I think the need for something like that, becomes really, really obvious when you're hit by a pandemic.
So I'll recommend George Schultz's editorial in today's Wall Street Journal describing Singapore's healthcare system. And I will certainly wish that when I'm 100 years old, I'm writing as cogent op-eds as that one. The trouble is the design question is how you have an adequate safety net without disincentives. Already in the US, our safety net imposes 70% is a conservative number, marginal tax rates on poor people, that when they earn an extra dollar, they only get 30 cents of the result. And it's the disincentives that cause the problem. I think it is possible to design a system that protects people without the disincentives in place. Of course, disincentives are a dirty word in these discussions. So our system and Europe's system are both horrendously inefficient at the amount of help they provide. And this matters. Throughout Europe, GDP per capita is 25% less than the US, a quarter. That's just an enormous amount that's being lost there. So I certainly think that's the discussion.
Yeah, but isn't it the case that we pay roughly twice what Europeans do per capita for healthcare, and we get much worse outcomes?
Our healthcare system it's a epitome of American inefficiency. We do not have a private healthcare system. We have a government-run oligopoly. It's practically a fascist healthcare system.
Well, look, you're not going to get any argument from me that it's a badly designed system, right?
We need to fix healthcare.
Yeah, we need to fix healthcare.
Can I suggest maybe a point of agreement and direct a question to Frank? Frank, are there situations in which really the problems we're facing were caused by government regulation that we could focus on first? So I'm thinking now of the issue of inequality of opportunity in the inner cities, the effect that redlining of neighborhoods, for example, that had during the Great Migration after the Civil War. I mean, are there maybe points of agreement? What a starting point might be, because really what I'm trying to do now is find places where we can all start together, right, across the political spectrum and so forth. Do you have anything to suggest along those lines, Frank, of taking the government created as maybe a first step?
Like education, for example.
Yeah, well, certainly the problem, I think, is that we'd all agree that we need to fix the healthcare system and we need to fix the education system. But then when you actually get into the mechanisms, then immediately you start diverging again. I do think that it's important, though, that we find a kind of safe space where you can actually have rational discussions about these kinds of issues, because I really do think that the fault is not by any means entirely on one side or the other. So yeah, I'm all in favor of that.
Can we maybe turn for the last part of our discussion from these domestic issues where we can all agree there's a problem, but we can't agree on the solution, and talk about some of the things you say in your essay, Frank, about the international scene, because these seem to be pretty important and powerful statements. Quote, "The global distribution of power will continue to shift eastward, since East Asia has done better at managing the situation than Europe or the United States." And here's another quote, "Over the years to come, the pandemic could lead to the United States' relative decline, the continued erosion of the liberal international order, and a resurgence of fascism around the globe." Now, that's a pretty scary prospect. Talk a bit about the global consequences of the pandemic and these problems that, as you say, it's shone such a bright light on. There is obviously more than one scenario in your essay, and I want to leave time for the more optimistic one that you countenance. But let's start with the worst case scenario: shift of power to the east, but not only that, but potentially a decline of the US and some resurgence of fascism. This is a scary prospect.
Well, I think, that scenario is very easy to draw because we've already been living in a period where we've seen increasing nationalism, xenophobia, isolationism, and so forth. And so you have an international pandemic, and that simply accelerates those trends. I think a lot of people have been thinking along those lines. And, there are going to be black swan effects we're not even aware of. I mean, actually, I sort of think that if you hadn't had 3 months of the country being shut in, the George Floyd protests would probably not have been as large. And that's already a very unexpected, consequence that nobody would have predicted, I think, necessarily in February. But I do think it's important to point out, as you just did, that was only one scenario. I think that this is also a big opportunity because the crisis has exposed a lot of weaknesses in healthcare systems, in inequality, in a lot of other areas where governments should have been performing better. So there will definitely be authoritarians around the world that are going to take full advantage of this crisis to extend their powers. But you could also have, a moment where you could get very serious reform in democracies themselves. I pointed out in the essay that the Great Depression is commonly credited with having accelerated the rise of Hitler and Mussolini in Europe, which it undoubtedly did. But it also led to, the 1932 election of Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, the laying of the American welfare state, and you wouldn't have had those kinds of reforms. Now, I know not everybody thinks that those were great reforms, but I do, and they wouldn't also have happened if you hadn't had a huge economic disaster. So I think you could get similar kinds of shifts in a more progressive direction coming out of this crisis as well.
Can I question you a bit about this shift to the east? Because it seems to me to be quite widely accepted that this is at least a milestone in a transition of power from the United States to China, even if we're not entirely in an Asian century. I wonder if there's another way of thinking about this, namely that the crisis, which after all originated in China, and I think originated in large measure because of pathologies of the one-party state, might actually be doing more damage to the stability of the Chinese system than we in the West recognize. It's a bit like after Chernobyl. People in the West didn't realize just how fatally holed the Soviet Union was below the waterline by the mid-1980s, though people within the Soviet Union did. Could it be that we're slightly missing the problems that this is causing China? I was struck last week by the announcement that they're going to bring back street vendors into the streets of Chinese cities, which sounds like a very desperate attempt to keep the unemployment rate from going up officially. Any signs of fundamental cracks in the system there, Frank?
Well, I don't see any evidence of fundamental cracks, but I certainly hope that some of what you say turns out to be true, because I do think this crisis revealed a lot of weaknesses, beginning with the government's wanting to cover up the epidemic, when it started. But there's a lot of areas where they're going to show weakness. I mean, they've never, since 1978, had a recession. This is the first time that they're actually seeing declining, quarter-on-quarter GDP. And a lot of their legitimacy has been tied to this economic performance. And so that's a big challenge. I think a lot of Belt and Road projects are now going south because the client states cannot afford the loans that they've agreed to with the Chinese. And it's not a transparent system, so we don't really understand what's going on below the surface in terms of their leadership politics. But it could be that there are, much sharper questions about the legitimacy of Xi Jinping, among other people, since he's personally taken, such a big role in within the leadership, where you no longer have collective leadership. It's really all about him. So you're right. I hope some of those weaknesses are true. When I said I think it's going to accelerate the shift to Asia, I didn't mean to China necessarily. I think that it's going to be to Asia as a whole. And one of the positive things I think that's going on actually as a result of Trump's trade war is the diversification of supply chains out of China. If you can move to Bangladesh or to Vietnam or to some other place, I think this is the time to do it. And that's also something that I think is going to negatively affect China in the long run.
Here's a hypothesis for all three of you. What's going to turn out to be the significance of COVID-19 is not so much its economic or domestic political consequences, but its geopolitical consequences. We're seeing not only an escalation of Cold War II between the US and China, but now we have border clashes between China and India in the news. Russians deploying fighter jets to Libya, which appears to be getting divided in two between Turkish-backed and Russian-backed forces. I wonder if it's going to be, for future historians, really the geopolitical consequences of COVID-19 that matter. That's part of what I was prompted to think by reading your essay. Maybe the real surprises yet to come this year, the black swans, if you like, will in fact be in geopolitics. Any thoughts on that?
That's entirely possible. I think that anytime you get a big redistribution of global power, you're going to get very unanticipated consequences. I do think that even if Biden is elected in November, you're still going to have a very divided United States, and it's simply not going to be able to return to the kind of international role that I would like to see. So I think that essentially this weakening of the American role internationally is going to happen pretty much regardless of what goes on in November.
HR, my old friend Graham Allison published an essay just the other day saying that we might actually be closer to hot war with China than we realize. And he drew an analogy with the sanctions that the US imposed on Japan in 1939 through to 41, culminating in the oil embargo, which forced the hands of the imperial government and led pretty much directly to Pearl Harbor. In Graham's analogy, it's the imposition of a ban on China's imports of semiconductors from companies like TSMC in Taiwan that would be the equivalent economic pressure that precipitates a drastic action. This must have been the kind of thing you were thinking about when you were working on national security strategy as national security advisor and revising the national security strategy. We've got very used to using economic sanctions as a country over the last 20 years. Is there a risk that we might overuse economic pressure and trigger a kind of crisis, whether over Taiwan or some other place?
I think the reason why China's emboldened is because we haven't competed effectively, and I think Graham's latest essay is a great example of our propensity toward self-flagellation. States and to blame ourselves even for the actions of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, if sanctions go against them like we would any other country who put 1 to 3 million people into concentration camps, tried to eliminate the freedom of the people in Hong Kong, has now threatened Taiwan, has become more aggressive in the South China Sea with the most recent event in Malaysia, is creating a border crisis with India. And I think what you're seeing what Frank alluded to a little bit in the discussion, is I think a combination of the Chinese Communist Party's ambitions and their fears. I think to a certain extent, Xi Jinping, he thinks he's playing a pretty good hand right now, despite the recession, because he's the crises in the United States. And if you're the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, you probably don't really tolerate a lot of diversity of opinions around you, right? I mean, I forget what the number was when they voted on Hong Kong. It was 2,558 to 1 or something. So I think that he's in an echo chamber. He thinks, wow, I've got hypersonic missiles. I have a much more capable People's Liberation Army. Look at the crises in the United States. They're being torn apart by domestic unrest, and vitriolic partisan politics, and so there's a perception of weakness. And I think that's really what is more dangerous than any kind of sanctions that we place on the Chinese Communist Party. I think sanctions in many ways are overdue, and they ought to be multinational based on the behavior of the regime. What's unfortunate, I think, about the approach that our friend Graham, for whom I have tremendous respect, has taken in the book, or at least how his book's interpreted, and in this essay, is that it poses this false choice, right, between passivity and acquiescence to the Chinese Communist Party and confrontation. And I think if we don't compete effectively, if we don't galvanize our like-minded partners to confront the party, then I think we are actually on a path to confrontation. And so I think multilateral action is what's needed now. There have been some very promising signs with that type of coordination, especially with the Australians and in Southeast Asia. Japan backed off a little bit in recent days, but has been really stalwart on this and has taken the lead in a lot of countermeasures to the Chinese Communist Party's coercion. But hey, I think what I'm worried about a lot now, though, is what if the People's Liberation Army believes the party's propaganda? What if they believe now is the time for them to take center stage, that they are almighty now? So I agree that the chances are high for a confrontation, but I think to reduce those chances, we ought to be more determined to confront really the abhorrent behavior of the Chinese Communist Party.
Frank, you kind of prophesied the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I still remember the excitement with which I read your essay. I was a graduate student in Berlin when you published it. Can you get your crystal ball out for us now and tell us what's next? Could we end up finding ourselves in a hot war even as early as this year, or is there something else that we're missing that you are able to discern with that uncanny ability that you have?
Well, first of all, I have to correct you. I wasn't actually predicting anything in particular, and I don't think I haven't been good at that in the past, and I don't think I'm going to get good at it in the future. What I said in my essay was you can actually have a very optimistic prediction and a very pessimistic one. I tended to think that the pessimistic outcomes would outweigh the optimistic ones simply as a result of numbers, that there are many more countries that have been put under great stress that aren't going to do well, and that's going to be a formula for problems. But, if you think about the long-term consequences of the Great Depression or, the fall of the Berlin Wall or the financial crisis in 2008 or September 11th, we're not going to know. It's not going to be a matter of 2 or 3 years. A lot of those consequences aren't going to show up for a decade or 2 decades. The fact that you'd had the rise of populist parties all over the rich world after the financial crisis, that's something that I think no one really would have predicted. So that's just a long-winded way of avoiding an answer to your question.
We've only got a few minutes left, and I just want to make sure that we don't leave out an important economic question. As you argue, Frank, big government is kind of here and getting bigger, certainly in fiscal terms, and in terms of the Fed's balance sheet. The response to the pandemic has been to create legitimacy for policies that used to be regarded by conservatives as fringe, from universal basic income to modern monetary theory. And I guess my question for John is, where do we end up? Do we end up in a more inflationary world? Maybe not this year, because it feels like deflation's the short run problem. But taking a longer view, do you think there's anything to be said, John, for the idea that we're actually steering our way back to the 1970s? I remember Ken Rogoff made this point early in the crisis, that supply shock plus monetary expansion usually leads to stagflation. Is that in your crystal ball?
Not in the short run. We have a very different financial system in the 1970s, and I think that made the inflation break out faster than otherwise. What we will have at the end of this is an enormous amount of debt. Within the short run, the opportunity to fund that debt at low interest rates, and we'll see how long that short run lasts. So what we face is just the classic problems that you as a historian will recognize of countries with 100 to 50% debt to GDP ratios, no particular prospect of strong fiscal surpluses to pay them down, and how do we get out of it? A sharp inflation can come, it's a form of a debt crisis. You can have an actual debt crisis, or you can return to strong supply side growth and fiscal probity and grow out of it. Those will be our choices. But the nature of our financial and monetary system, I don't think, leads to the kind of thing that happened under the breakdown of Bretton Woods and the gold standard that we had in the early 1970s, which really accelerated that inflation.
Well, as we've been talking, it struck me repeatedly that it's going to be very hard to call even the rest of 2020, never mind the 2020s. This has been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you all, especially Frank, for joining us here on GoodFellows. And that's it for another episode of GoodFellows. We'll be back next week with a new topic, a new conversation, and you never know, maybe a new guest. On behalf of the Hoover GoodFellows, myself, H.R. McMaster, John Cochran, and our special guest GoodFellow, Francis Fukuyama, as well as everyone here at the Hoover Institution, we wish you and yours the very best. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you next week.